Okay, let's get started. I see a nice group of 20 people here. That's wonderful. Thank you for coming. Thank you for those of you who have already started introducing yourselves in the chat. If you just came in, I think it would be nice for us to get to know each other a little bit. So say a few words about yourself. Hi, Ali, nice to see you. And lots of other people I know here. So thank you for coming. So the other thing is, if you feel comfortable, turn your video on. I would appreciate it, because if you did so, feels more like a conversation. So today we are going to talk about how to start your own Growing Up in Science series. And I know that some of you have already taken steps towards that. So is there anybody here who currently has a running series? Maybe you can just raise your hand or unmute yourself and say me. Or
yeah, we have one in your deck.
Awesome. Hi, Dobby. Yeah.
Hey.
Is there anyone who is thinking of starting one in the short term, let's say, like concrete plans to do something in fall, let's say? Okay, I see one hand up, Sene. And then it's perfectly fine if you're just here out of interest in seeing if this is something for you. So I thought I'd start by just sharing a little bit of the history of the series. I'll mention a few of the existing chapters, and then I'll bring up a list of things we can discuss, and I'll let that be guided by your questions. So the brief history started in July 2014, when I was an invited speaker in the Netherlands at Radboud University, and I was doing the regular thing where the speaker meets with students and postdocs. But on a whim, I decided to do something different. And they said, today we're not going to talk about science, we're going to talk about the experience of being a scientist and issues that might come up in your practice as a scientist. And people would bring up issues such as issues with mentorship or interpersonal issues in the lab, or doubts about scientific careers. And this was eye-opening to me, that there was such a need to talk about these themes, and there was no real venue for that, because normally you don't have that kind of conversation as a guest speaker. And even at my own institution, New York University, there was no natural venue of having those kinds of conversations. So together with Christina Alberini, a colleague of mine in the Center for Neuroscience, I decided to start Growing Up in Science series. There were a couple of other events that led up to that. One event is that I had lunch with Christina, and Christina, besides being an excellent neuroscientist, she, in her free time, is also a psychoanalyst. And we were talking about her career in psychoanalysis. And at some point, we were sort of joking around, like, oh, don't you think that all graduate students need some form of psychotherapy? And then we realized that that's not really a joke, right? Like, there are a lot of mental health needs that are unmet among trainees, and there is often too little attention for those needs within a standard academic system. And I must say that since then it's gotten better, but this was definitely a motivation for us to also start talking more openly about the stories behind the science. And then the other event that led up to this was my own experience of having imposter feelings. Remarkably, I don't know if it's remarkable, but I had those up to a quite advanced career stage. Even as a young faculty, I still had imposter feelings, like, do I really belong here? Is this my community? And at some point, a colleague of mine pointed out that this had a name, that it was called imposter complex or imposter syndrome. And that was again a revelation to me, like the idea that would have a name, and that was validating. for this to have a name and to know that others would have similar feelings. And this was a time where on positive feelings were very little talked about, and fortunately also that has gotten better. But I continue to think that growing up in science like serves some role in addressing those feelings and making them more like less taboo to talk about. In 2017, I wrote a one-page article called "The Stories Behind the CV," and many people around the world got to read that and started thinking whether they wanted to start their own series. So the local series took off in the years surrounding that. So I believe that the first one was actually at the Donders Institute in Nijmegen. They started a series in 2015, and then a couple of others followed. 2017, Path in Psychological Science, University of Denver, different name, same concept. In 2018, I was fortunate enough to be part of the first event at the Columbia Zuckerman Institute. In 2018 as well, in Zurich, 2019, Penn Mindcore, Behind the CV. They have recordings of many of their events, and I encourage you to check those out. And as of now, I believe there are over 20 local series. I haven't really kept very good tabs on that. Now, when the pandemic hit, we decided we took that as an opportunity to spread this idea more widely and also share it with places that don't necessarily have the capacity to start their own series. So we started an online series. Part of the events in the online series were traditional events where you had a single speaker telling their life story, their life and career story. And later, shortly after, we also included themed sessions on mentorship and anti-racism. And those were sometimes more panel discussions. I'm happy to announce that Princeton University Press is interested in publishing a book with growing up in science stories. They would like to focus this on psychology and neuroscience. And I'm still trying to put together a list of like authors who would contribute chapters to that book. So if you know of someone who has a compelling story that you believe deserves to be included, we have space for only a very limited number, like 30 to 40. Please let me know. Now, why growing up in science? Since you're here, we probably can go over this relatively quickly. One major goal has been to close the gap between faculty and trainees. What I often say is that as trainees, as a trainee, I personally often felt that faculty were a different kind of human being, right? They were so excellent, and they were so much on a pedestal, and they must be categorically different from ordinary mortals, right? And of course, it's not like this, but it's an idea that you often grow up with throughout the scientific career, and that can cause a lot of feelings of insecurity. Like, can I ever reach that Olympic level? So growing up in science closes that gap, makes the perspective that you have on faculty more realistic, points out that faculty who are now considered successful, they often went through lots of struggles and detours throughout their careers. There might be issues that they're starting with now, and those stories don't typically come out if you just hear them talk about their science. That's not something that easily gets addressed. And some of our most inspiring of growing up in science are the ones where we hear about extensive second careers or earlier careers, and to be honest, also like great difficulties that the speakers had to face. And I deliberately use the word face instead of overcome, because I don't want these growing up in science stories to be always like success stories. Sometimes there are just difficulties that continue to figure in the background. I already mentioned making personal struggles less taboo. In a very loose sense of the word, this is a form of collective therapy where We talk about topics that might be perceived as weaknesses. Like I talk a lot about my struggles with procrastination and my earlier struggles with imposter complex, and the difficulties of being in a long distance relationship. And those are, again, things that don't easily get talked about, especially between trainees and their advisors, because there's always implicitly an understanding that you have to impress your advisor, and you have to that might come with the sense that you have to keep up a facade and also show only strength and not weakness. So creating a safe space for expressing vulnerabilities is an important part of this series. And then more broadly, creating inclusive and open communities. So Growing Up in Science is fundamentally about belonging and about creating a sense of belonging in people who might be lacking that sense, or who might be part of groups who have traditionally been excluded from science. So inclusion is just an important theme that hopefully we can contribute a little bit to. And open communities, Growing Up in Science is very much humanistic in philosophy, right? We want to look at people's stories holistically, right? The scientists are not that just their publications, it's not just their CVs, it is they are full human beings, and we want to understand each other stories within the broadest context possible to truly understand each other and create stronger communities. Okay. This is a slightly different framing of the goals. This is from the series in Denver. The goals here are formulated as: first, to validate the variation in trainees' experiences with the variety of experiences shared by different psychologists. And second, to share lessons learned and perspective gained from life as a psychological scientist, aiming to reduce imposter syndrome, to dispel myths surrounding graduate education and academia, and to give trainees greater appreciation for their own paths. I think that's also very well said. The Donders Institute aims to decrease the perceived gap between students, PhD candidates, and more experienced scientists. Questions such as, do you have hobbies? Interesting how that's a binary, right? Do you have hobbies? Do you procrastinate? What do you like most about doing research? Will be asked and discussed during the event. Discussion is not supposed to be about scientific content or general career advice, but rather about individual career life and experience of one scientist at a time. I very much endorse that sentiment. I always discourage speakers from trying to offer advice. I'm not a big fan of advice, and the reason I say that is that advice comes with the connotation of generality, right? Like that's one person's experience applies to another person, and you have to be super careful with that, because experiences exist within a context, and they may make sense in that context, but not in a different context, right? And similarly, I really don't think that this is a very scientific. Growing Up in Science follows a scientific method in any way, right? This is an N of one at a time, but more holistically. So this is much more like oral histories in journalism or narrative medicine. Okay, so if you're interested in starting your own series, or you have a starting series and you have some questions, and there are questions that will come up. These are some of the questions that might come up. So one is, what's your audience, right? So we already talked about trainees broadly being the audience, but then you have to say which departments to include, or how many departments to include. So that's something that comes up. Then related to that is, what's your pool of speakers? So naturally you would include the faculty in your own departments, but do you go broader than that? Or do you include PhD holding scientists who left academia? Speaker selection, like how do you balance the different requirements for not necessarily requirements, but how do you create a good balance among speakers? Think juniority, seniority, underrepresented groups, etc. Meeting frequency. So there's a wide variety among this among different series. Some go once every month, once every 2 months, twice a year, once a year. What are the pros and cons of each? meeting format. So my format is always have the speaker tell their life story in free form, freestyle narrative, and then after that, questions. I've also experimented a little bit with a more active moderator, so more interview style. Who would organize this? How do you create sustainability across the years, right? So is this sometimes completely student driven? If there's a faculty member, what's the role of the faculty member? Or should this be purely faculty driven to reduce the burden on the trainees? How do you encourage honesty? That's sometimes hard, right? Like, do you give specific instructions to the speakers? What do they do if they go off the rails and start talking about their discoveries? And then recording and sharing. Like, so of course, we want to share these stories with people in places that don't have access to their own series, but recording and sharing could reduce the speaker's tendency to be very frank about their lives. And so those are some of the things I'd like to discuss with you, and maybe this part can be guided by your questions or your concerns. So let's give that a try. So anybody here who wants to dive into one of these topics? And you should be able to unmute yourself.
Wei Ji, I wanted to discuss more about the organizing committee or the organization in thinking about bringing this here to Emory. So I know over at NYU that grad students are involved, and I guess I'd like to get a sense of, you know, how in your experience that has worked in terms of who is kind of guiding the ship with things.
Yeah, so actually at NYU, graduate students are involved in only one event a year. So we have a special event in summer, which is about what I wish I had known about a PhD, and that's where the graduate students take an active role. The other events during the year are organized by myself only. I generally would recommend that you have a committee rather than a single person, just to lessen the burden. But I don't have very strong opinions about whether that should be faculty or students. So I think that students tend to have more enthusiasm to organize, but they also have more turnover and they can get busy very suddenly. So there are some trade-offs there. Faculty are a more long-term presence, hopefully, in the department. So that's definitely guarantees some level of continuity. And you can think of mixtures of those two. I think what's important is that you, even no matter how many organizers you have, that you are cognizant of possible biases that these organizers have, and try to correct for those. I try to be conscious of it, but I don't know how good of a job I'm doing. Brian.
Hi, thanks. Can I ask you about, in your experience, what how selecting departments to kind of target and include has worked well, and what are the failure modes there?
Yep, great. So in my experience, what has worked well is grouping departments that already talk to each other. So at NYU, that is psychology, the downtown neuroscience, and the medical school neuroscience. So those three departments already talk to each other and have joint seminars, etc. So that means that you don't have to create something new in order to have like joint interest from those departments. And there's the same faculty teach students from all those departments and our own students committee. So I think that's sort of the easy way. There are places that have tried to do this much more broadly. So I believe, so I forgot which places, but they have tried to do this through a graduate student council or union, that something that's much broader across departments. That could also work really well, as long as that organization has some sort of track record of bringing people together. And of course, it can be sort of be a greater threshold to go listen to somebody outside of your own department, somebody you've never heard of. That could be a barrier. But on the other hand, it could be really refreshing. yeah, there's different ways that could work for different places. Yeah, you can experiment with this, right? You can start small and say, okay, let's try to include an extra department, see how that works. Now, the choice of which departments to include interacts with the question of meeting frequency. The reason being that you have to sort of default speaker pool, and you want to rotate through that over the course of, let's say, the life of a PhD student, right? The tenure of a PhD student, right? So if you have a cycle of maybe 5 years, I think that's great. So if you have too few faculty to sustain that, then either you have to reduce the meeting frequency or include more departments. There's a question in the chat. For recording and sharing, do you find that recording talks would discourage speakers from sharing their experience candidly? Yeah. So if you had asked me this 4 years ago, definitely yes. Pandemic has obviously changed the norms for this. And I now just ask the speaker if they are comfortable. And some just say no, and I make sure that it's absolutely okay to say no. And those speakers, they would self-select for like having greater openness in the absence of a recording. Others, they don't care very much. They just are happy to tell their stories, and they're happy for the world to hear it. Now, of course, I don't have the counterfactual, right? I don't know what they would have said about their miserable PhD experience with this person who's still very active in the field if they had not been recorded. But I lay that choice out for them in the beginning. I say, like, we want openness. That's the most important thing. If you're comfortable being open and being recorded, then by all means. Ali, did I answer your earlier question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, cool. Sene.
Yeah, my question would, so it's actually not on this slide, but my question would be about the length of the presentation and the question round,
Yep.
and also the presentation format itself, like the usage of slides. Do you
Yep.
have any recommendations on,
Yeah,
on
great.
this?
I'm really glad you're bringing that up. So in terms of duration, I go for the standard duration, more or less, which would be 1 hour, and I would divide that by into like maybe 30 to 40 minutes of the speaker telling their story. Usually that stretches to more like 50 minutes. And then we have open conversation. It's always been hard to get people to ask questions during a story, right? It's like interrupting a movie for a commercial break or so. That's it has a bit of that feeling. So people have some hesitance to interrupt a person's story, but sometimes you see that. Sometimes I as a moderator also intervene and say, hey, you talked about how you were a workaholic and then you got divorced. Where was there a relationship between those two events? Something like that. But that's not necessary, and it's not standard. And then slides, no. I say no to slides, period. Slides, they create a very formal atmosphere. They remind you of scientific talks. The only exception that I make for slides is for cute childhood pictures. That's the only exception. Ben is asking, have you found that junior faculty would be more reserved in sharing for fear of backlash when they go up for tenure review? Yeah, so great question. I would love to have see like a thorough study on this. I don't have any data on this. I don't know to what extent junior faculty are more reserved. I can easily imagine that they're more reserved, that things that might reflect poorly on their relationship on other people, maybe they might be more hesitant to bring up. That being said, we've had plenty of junior faculty who have been extremely open, and they sometimes are open because there are no other faculty present and it's not recorded. So that brings us to another issue that I just want to briefly address in a moment, whether you want to have other faculty present. I deliberately try to include junior faculty speaker lineups because they share experiences that senior faculty don't have. They grew up in a different time, with different experiences, and most importantly, they remember more of those experiences because it was like a shorter time ago. Sometimes what you see in older faculty is that they sort of rainbow white, no, sort of what, like they sort of whitewash their experiences where they everything was beautiful in the end, or they forgot the real feelings that came with earlier struggles. So I think we should have both. We should have junior and senior faculty, but yeah, it's possible that that there's some more hesitation among junior faculty. Now, I sometimes get a question: do you let faculty even attend growing up in science events? And my answer has been yes, and the reason is that I feel secure enough in the supportiveness of our community that I believe that honesty is not going to get penalized, and that depends on your own sense of your own community. It can be different in different places. I also think that the faculty who do attend, they self-select. So those are the ones who are generally very supportive of trainees, and there's a reason that they want to hear about human stories. So they are generally the ones who would greatly encourage this kind of open sharing. I know of places that have not allowed, that do not allow faculty. So these are student only, postdoc only events. And I can completely see the rationale for that. But yeah, I've made a different choice. If there are no immediate questions, I'll talk a little bit about the other issues. So yeah, I already said a little bit about balance between speakers, right? So junior, mid-level, senior speakers, I try to include, of course, try to create gender balance, pay special attention to underrepresented minorities within the standard speakers pool that's often limited by the faculty that you have. Within the global series, of course, we have much more freedom. And we do include speakers from outside academia. I think that's important, and trainees also want to hear those stories. So we've had speakers who went into nonprofit organizations, data science. We had a filmmaker. We had scientific editors, a wide variety of other professions. Typically once a year. Right? It's somewhat harder to get them. And we still want to focus on faculty that students, on PhD holding scientists that our trainees already know. But it's often extremely valuable to hear about life outside of academia. It's not a replacement for like proper career counseling, right? So many places, they have career advice sessions where PhD holding scientists from outside academia come to give career advice, and growing up in science is not a substitute for that. And again, this is not about advice, it's about people's individual paths, and you can easily have both of those. But yeah, I would encourage you to consider that, and the easiest pool would obviously be alumni of your own departments or your own programs, and they can sometimes have very relatable stories about their time in the department. So I'll just keep talking. So it was a question about format, right? So I favor freestyle narrative, but I know that others have also experimented with having audience members submit questions beforehand or even during. There are different platforms where you can have anonymous questions during the event. And that's interesting. I've not really done that. And I think it would work better if your meeting frequency is lower, right? Because otherwise it gets too burdensome for the attendees and couldn't get less response. But if you have 2 events a year, 1 or 2 events a year, then you can easily make it a little bit of a more elaborate event, right? So then you ask people to submit questions in advance or during the event, and maybe you have a reception afterwards. Free food always helps, those kind of things. The questions before can work well if the submitters have a sense of what this series is about, right? And of course, it's hard sometimes to ask in-depth questions about somebody's personal story without having heard the personal story. So yeah, that's something to consider. And then yeah, questions during would work better in that regard, but it requires a little bit more coordination. I mentioned free food. It's not a trivial matter. So definitely for community events, I encourage to get department resources to get free food. It's just a fact of academic life that will increase attendance and draw people in who otherwise would have trouble in overcoming the inertia. And it's very often that department leadership is actually extremely supportive of these kinds of events. I've heard that many times, that they're thinking, I wish we had something like that earlier. And even though they might not have the capacity to organize it themselves, they would give resources to those who do. How do you deal with speakers that may have negative views towards institutions or specific senior individuals that may be politically or socially controversial? So negative views towards institutions, definitely no issue with that. No issue with that. I think that needs to come up. And everybody who attends knows that these are speakers' individual opinions, right? So they can feel free to disagree. And specific senior individuals within academia, that's more sensitive. But there, I actually, my greater concern is that people would self-censor and not talk about those negative views. But if there are situations of abusive mentorship, for example, really bad mentorship, or advisors who don't expect like a respectable work-life balance, or major conflicts within a lab, those are exactly the kinds of things that we do want to talk about. So I encourage speakers to talk about those difficult moments. Of course, the speaker often will self-censor because the other person might still be in the field, and there might still be a power dynamic. And therefore, my concern is rather the opposite, that we would hear too little of that rather than too much of that. Political or socially controversial, we get plenty of that. Like we have had speakers talk about their activism in Palestine and in Nicaragua, and those things, and against sexual harassment in academia. Those are absolutely important topics that are part of people's stories. So I have no particular policy on that. I encourage speakers to talk about what makes them themselves, right? So to bring their whole selves to this conversation, and that often includes like activism, advocacy, and sort of opinions that you hold outside of academia. Yeah. If you are completely new to getting started, I would say start by assembling a small team, and that could be a group of students or postdocs. You could maybe ask the graduate student organization or the postdoc organization if there's anybody there who would like to co-organize. And if not, then maybe a fellow faculty member. And sorry, I'm assuming that majority here on the call are faculty, but that's absolutely not the wrong assumption. That shouldn't be an assumption. So get a team together, then start brainstorming about the issues on this slide, essentially. Like, I'm doing this deliberately in June, so you have enough time to get ready for fall, and start with 1 or 2 fall events. And don't start with necessarily the most high profile speaker, because for me, I made a mistake of having a bit of front loading of high profile speaker. Think the chair of the department chair, the provost, the president of the university. It will attract a lot of attention, but these are not necessarily the most honest conversations, because people in administrative positions tend to be much more cautious by nature of their position, right? So I would say start with well-known faculty members of any rank who you believe are honest and are willing to talk about their struggles. And you usually know who they are. You usually know the ones who already talk about these topics, or who are more accessible, or who are sort of go-to people when students have problems. So those would sort of set the right tone for the series. And then I mentioned briefly before, like, what do you do when a speaker goes sort of off track? So definitely you can correct that as a moderator. So if somebody gets really enthusiastic about their science and start talking about the contents of their papers, then you just gently steer it back. You say, oh, you mentioned how this paper took 10 years to produce. Can you tell me about how you felt about that process? Did you ever despair that it would ever get finished, or something like that, right? So more about the feelings and less about the scientific content. Ben is asking, have you had backlash against those controversial, for example, backlash from the ADL or the Jewish community for raising Palestinian issues? How would you handle those? Do we allow free expression or be sensitive to all communities? Yeah, so it's of course a very current discussion in academia right now. Like, what are the limits of freedom of speech? I have not had to deal with those issues myself. So this is probably because we are having these conversations within relatively intimate groups, so people who know and trust each other. And it would be unlikely that any outside organizations would hear about potentially controversial topics and then take them out of context. So it's and we're over and over emphasizing this is one person's opinions within the context of their life story. So the cases that I remember where, for example, the person who spoke openly about her activism for the Palestinian cause was extremely candid about that. Similar like activism against nuclear energy, and we just didn't hear anything about it. There was no backlash, essentially. Now, people might have their own misgivings about that person's stance, but at least I didn't hear about it, and I also didn't hear anything in their stories that was offensive. And yeah, I have to ask myself, like, what would I do if I were to hear something offensive? And but fortunately, I haven't had that experience personally. Were the departments you approached for financial report immediately on board, or did you need to give them a very hard sell? So I do not have any financial support for growing up in science, and that's not because my departments are not supportive. It's just that I didn't ask. I don't need financial support. People somehow keep coming without the free food. It's probably fortunate that way. I also have not. I probably would be able to get the free food and get the greater attendance, but I've just not bothered to do that at NYU. And in other places, is there anybody here who has experience with that? You can please raise your hand and tell me about your experiences. But as far as I know, it's not been that hard of a sell. Usually there's some discretionary funding for community events, and this is as much of a community event as it gets. So interestingly, some places also have attached growing with science events to their regular seminar speakers, seminar series. I personally do that. So if I get invited to give a talk, most recently, just a couple of days ago, I was at UCSD. I go under the condition that I also can do a growing up science event. And guess which kind of event is better received? My science or my growing up in science. But yeah, I know that other places have also done that. They invite seminar speakers to give their growing up science story. And that could be just a select number of those events or a special selection of speakers, because those are in principle different goals: to hear about good science and to hear about somebody's story. There could be different sets of criteria. But yeah, that could make it easier to get departmental funding if you have external speakers for both their science and for their life story. And internally, I think that there's usually, if the department has the resources, then there's usually very little trouble to spend them on something that clearly serves everyone in the community. Ballpark budget, make concrete for anyone thinking of approaching department, is about dollars, specific to skill, but just a general ballpark. Yeah, I would say a couple $100 for free food, an event, I would say. So you can get pretty far with $300 or so, especially if you do something like sandwiches and cookies or so. Yeah. Dobby.
So I want to ask you about preparing with the speaker. Early on, what we used to do is just send an email and maybe link to a couple of growing up in science talks that are on YouTube. I don't know how many of those actually got watched because they're long and faculty don't have a lot of time.
Yeah.
Then we've just added to that email more and more instructions, like don't do slides after somebody just did a lot of slides. And that gentle sort of steering that you talked about, it's actually really difficult to do.
Yeah.
So if somebody has prepared, they would talk about science, but then they would talk about also what they did, because that's part of who they are. It's really hard to get them out of it, right? So what are you doing ahead of
So my default assumption, which probably stems from my own experience, is that people don't read their emails, and the longer the email, the less likely that people are going to read it. So early in the series, when this was completely unknown at NYU, I would just request a 15-minute conversation with the speaker in advance. And instead of having them watch a YouTube video, they were forced to watch me during those 15 minutes. And I would explain what to do and what not to do in the event itself. And I would definitely emphasize not about advice, not about the science, about your holistic story, about your weakness, about struggles, failures, detours. The other thing that helped is unofficial stories. So we started that a couple years in, and requesting that forces the speaker to already think about the nature of the event. And we would include a link to example growing up science stories, but because they have to respond, they would actually typically look at those examples, or at least that's my assumption, right? And then if you feel that the unofficial story and the official story are too similar to each other, then you can give some feedback at that point still, right? So we're still 1 or 2 weeks out at that point. So we say, hey, you mentioned that graduate school was all smooth sailing, but there must have been some difficult. Could you see? Are there any difficulties that you wish to bring up, and then maybe steer that a little bit in advance? I've done that a couple of times. By now at NYU, the series is sufficiently well known that I don't have to do that anymore. And the 15-minute pre-conversations, I also don't have to do anymore, but I used to do it religiously before each event. Yeah.
And just to follow up on that, so is the unofficial story sort of a turnoff, because then you need to do a little bit more work ahead of time, and our faculty?
No, I think people are very used to submitting abstracts for talks, right? So I present it as the equivalent of that. So if you agree to a talk, you ask to submit an abstract, agreed to grow up science talk. You asked to submit an unofficial story. It's yeah, I haven't heard any issues with that. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, if not, I'll be looking in case something comes up in the next minute. But I do want to announce that if you want to take this a little bit further, then next week on Monday, June 12th, we're going to have an annual organizers meeting. So these are people who already have their own series, and we're going to just exchange experiences and see how everybody is doing. So if you're a prospective organizer, you're very welcome to join this. And you can also get on the mailing list for that. Or even if you cannot attend the event, then you'll get on the mailing list for very occasional emails that would be, sorry, it's not very occasional, because the global series gets announced to that list. So that's every month. Oh yeah, I should also mention that the chapters right now are a bit of a loose collection, but we're hoping to have sort of a central hub, a website that can serve all of the chapters. So if you have events that are hybrid or online only, and you would like to share them with the world, then we can advertise that event on our website and through Twitter, etc. Right? So as organized, I'm hoping to build also a community of organizers so that we can learn from each other. And that's really all I had. Any concluding questions or remarks? Sene.
Yeah, I was also interested in, like, if there would be any email templates or something like that as to how you would typically invite
Yes, that's right.
speakers.
Yeah.
And then a second small question I had is if you have a recommended audience size that you kind of want to work towards related to something that was mentioned earlier, like grouping departments.
Yep. Good. Great. Glad you bring both those things up. So email templates, yes, we have those, and they're part of the organizer's handbook. And I'm happy to share that with any prospective organizers. And you can just pick and choose and modify as you like. And there are some of the things that we talked about today are also in that handbook. And the second, audience size, I should start by saying there's enormous variability, in part time of the semester or trimester, and parts who's a speaker, how well known is the speaker, how interesting does the speaker seem, etc. So this is not really under your control, that kind of variability. I've had at NYU have had events with 80 attendees. I've had events with fewer than 10, and it's all fine, and they all have pros and cons. I would say that a typical seminar size, whatever the standard is for seminar sizes in your department, would be quite good to aim for. And you'll probably get a little bit more than that because of the special nature of these events. And of course, if you feel that there is huge demand for this, you can increase the frequency. If there's lower attendance than you would had hoped, then you can potentially reduce the frequency. I think there's also places that have experimented with 2 speakers each event. I think there's even a model, I think Princeton does this or used to do this, where the previous speaker interviews the next speaker. But yeah, I stick to sort of the traditional format. I feel that 2 speakers per event already starts reducing the speaker story to sort of the highlights rather than the complete story. And yeah, that's why I'd rather give the speaker plenty of time. And I have speakers who think I have nothing to talk about, and before you know, it's more than an hour. So people have more to say than they think, but maybe have suppressed how much they have to talk about. And also, once they're talking, they want to keep talking, and it's great. All right, no more questions. If you have more questions, just email me. Hope this was helpful. Brian has asked the community promoting what the series is all about, what has been effective for spreading the word. I would definitely send a single, like an opening email to the community saying, this is what this is about, this is what it's not. Here you can see some examples. And then have that coupled with an announcement of the first speaker, who should be someone who is likely to attract a sizable audience. So and then in the first few events, at least, I give an introduction over and over again. I say, for those of you who are new, this is what the series is about. So make everybody feel welcome and understand the concept. Cool. Thank you all for coming. Email me if you have any questions. Hope to see some of you next week, and good luck thinking about a potential series. Take care.